Okay, so you can see your pushes westward really being driven by economic incentives. So when crop prices rise, you see people moving into the land to grow these crops. Gold and silver as well. So when gold and silver, obviously in California here, you have the initial westward migration due to the discovery of gold. All right, and so you can see some of this. You can see land scales spike when wheat prices go up. You can also see spikes following corn prices over here too. So the spike in corn and wheat prices. So you can see essentially these commodity price spikes driving that westward migration when it becomes now it's profitable to be a farmer. So there are lots of people who say, oh, you know what, I can either strike out on my own. I can, now at these higher prices, I can afford to be a farmer, or, even people leaving the city to become farmers. Okay. So the question is, as I mentioned, is like, what are we going to do with this land that the U.S. Has acquired? Even before the Louisiana Purchase, the settlers are pushing westward into kind of that frontier area, that early frontier, which is basically past the Appalachia Mountains. And so the Federalist idea is, okay, the Federalist says the government owns this land. What we should do, remember this is before like income taxes, basically there's really not much revenue for the federal government outside of tariffs. And so they say, look, well, here's what we should do. We should sell it. We should just sell it to the highest bidder. All right. The Jeffersonian idea is like, okay, well, if we sell to the highest bidder, that will lead to kind of these large land holdings. We don't want that. Remember, Jefferson wants a nation of small farmers. So he says, let's sell it, below market prices, kind of like open this up a little more. Now, the Land Ordinance of 1785 really organizes this territory into these like square blocks, saying, okay, we're gonna have these like big square blocks. Certain areas going to be reserved to sell off. Certain areas going to be reserved for schools, and then we're going to do the public auction. We're going to do this public auction system. It's that the government never really makes much money off it because it's just difficult to enforce. I mean, this is a time period where the federal government is very small. There's not much of an army, and again, there's lots of land, and so people essentially just move out and squat on the land without having to pay. So this sort of takes care of how we're going to decide who gets it. I mean, they try to basically sell it off at the highest bidder. Doesn't really work that well. So, okay, that's 1785. And then 1787 decides, okay, how are we going to organize this territory? And basically they say it's going to be part of the federal government. So it's not going to be part of states. So this essentially, because then your states that are on the westernmost edge have this advantage of getting this land and getting more people. And so what they say is the federal government's going to have the land, and then once enough people are there, they can become a different state. All right. And so it kind of establishes the system of how these territories move from territories to states, to individual states, instead of, as I said, being a part of the states that came previously. So these two acts kind of organize that westward territory. Okay. And so here you have sort of this initial territory right here. This is the frontier in the late 1700s. This area up here is the frontier. And these are when they join, when they become states. Okay. And I assigned a video, like a little short YouTube video that kind of like shows this survey methodology. And you'll notice when you fly over the U.S., when you're flying over the U.S., you can really just see it in play. You can see the places that had this survey and places that didn't have the survey. And so you can see the square plots when you're flying, and you can actually see it turn to kind of a system that was not organized, where land was much more idiosyncratic. But really, all of this territory has these sort of organizations as like town. These little grids are townships, and you can see that they persist to the present. Okay. All right. And so initially, they basically, as the 19th century goes on, Congress is making it easier to buy the land. So there used to be like a minimum purchase amount, like you had to buy, kind of large amounts of land. They keep lowering. Okay, you can buy smaller and smaller. And by the time we get here, by 1832, it's 2-month wages for a 40-acre farm. All right, which is not not. I mean, imagine if imagine if a house in Los Angeles cost 2 months' wages. We would all be homeowners. And there's rebates for veterans, and there's also just rampant squatting. And so essentially the US has like this history of squatting where people just go squat on land. And then eventually we get the Homestead Act, which essentially just guarantees 160 acres. If you, move into, uninhabited land, it's yours. You just have to improve it. Again, notice when this is passed, when the South is not around. Okay. Now, squatters, as I mentioned, it's essentially, there's lots of squatting. And the kind of like the local population prevents speculators from coming in and buying up the squatters' land. And essentially the way they do this is when the land goes up for auction, they all show up with guns and they say, no one else. They basically intimidate anybody else from buying it. Besides the squatters. So initially this is done through force or in intimidation, where the local population essentially all shows up with their guns. And they say, look, that person's been squatting on the land. It's their land. No one else bid on it. Eventually it's more formalized, where the government just gives the squatters the first right to buy the land at auction. And even today we have like squatters' rights. Like it's, whatever. It's a dicey, it's still a dicey issue. All right. And so what this policy is successful in that, the US does have very high rates of land ownership, especially compared to your Latin American countries. So this is from the Engerman and Sokoloff paper that we saw previously, but you can see the US really has, especially in the West here, where 83% of households own land. And in Mexico in this time period, similar time period, very, very low. Okay. And so you can see kind of the population distribution of the US, where the West really is rising in terms of, dominations in terms of population. And notice what the West is defined as, by the way. It's Illinois, Indiana, Iowa. It's these states right here. So not necessarily what we consider the West today, but this is just shows that sort of westward shift, the westward center, population center shift of the US throughout the 1800s. Okay. Now, so there is this kind of ideal very much from the beginning of land ownership. We have that switch to private property. We have Jefferson, extolling the virtues of, small scale land ownership. And you can see this all the way up to the present, where the US basically, has all sorts of laws around home ownership. Basically, the ideal is for people to own their own homes. And you can see the US still has, pretty high home ownership rates. And so, it's around 50%. This is the 20th century right here. So you see at the initial 20th century, it's like less than 50%. We have a dip during the Great Depression as there was like a wave of foreclosures. And then we have this massive increase into the 60s. This is all caused, by the way, by an innovation in mortgages, the 30-year mortgage. So, now if you buy a home, you get a 30-year mortgage. So that allows you to pay low up front. You're paying it off over 30 years. At the end of 30 years, it's paid off. Okay. Fixed interest rate as well. So you kind of know what your monthly payments are going to be for those 30 years. This makes home ownership much more affordable relative to this time period when you were basically, there were 5-year loans, and you were just paying the interest, and then after 5 years, you basically owe the rest of the loan. So that innovation, again, we see an institutional change that's not really what you would even think of as an innovation. It's not like a new, it's not some magical new device. Like that institutional change to private property led to higher yields. This institutional change, which was driven by government, actually, the government in the Great Depression bought up all these mortgages and extended the terms of the mortgage. And then lo and behold, people paid them off. The government made a ton of money. And so the private sector was like, well, the government made a ton of money on those 30-year loans. Let's do that instead of these 5-year loans that we were doing. And so it was really this like institutional or like financial instrument innovation that led to this increased rate of home ownership that we see throughout this elevated rate that we see throughout the back half of the 20th century. All right. And so the legacies of this initial, these initial ideals about private property and yeoman farmer that kind of are baked in there at the founding, there's lots of good things about that. So, you have like a relatively equal distribution you have relatively high rates of home ownership, which is, a good thing for democracy, a good thing for kind of wealth, equality between people, between households. But there's lots of bad things too that we're really seeing, that we're really feeling the pain of in the present, at least the pre-pandemic present. So what are the issues? Well, the issues are cities have become more and more the engines of economic growth. So cities in the present are really where all the economic activity takes place. It's where all the innovation is. It's where all the good jobs are. This is because of agglomeration, which is like a fancy word for basically, the ideas that come from when everyone's together, the spillovers that come from all these people being around each other, all these companies being near each other. Those spillovers, agglomeration gets much more important as, technology becomes more prevalent, as we have more and more essentially knowledge economies. And so all of this stuff is taking place in cities. In the US, you basically have superstar cities that are driving most of the economic growth. It's LA, it's the Bay Area, it's Seattle, San Diego as well. On the West Coast here, New York, DC, Boston on the East Coast, Atlanta to some extent in the South, and you're kind of the Texas Triangle. Chicago, so you have all these cities that are really, the hubs. If you look at the economic activity of the US, it's really just all in these cities. Now, it's hard to do home ownership in cities, or it's not the ideal form of a living situation in cities because you want dense populations. Dense populations, you want apartments. Ownership in apartments is hard because it's a collective action issue where essentially you kind of need somebody in charge of the building to kind of maintain and do the building. It's not really ideal to have, a bunch of different homeowners, each in a building. So actually apartments are kind of better for city living. That's better to be rented rather than owned. But because of this, all of these like legacies of ownership, we've kind of like enshrined home ownership, and it's kind of like this ideal and has all sorts of legal advantages. When you get older, you go to do your taxes. If your tax guy is anything like my tax guy, your tax guy is going to yell at you for not owning your own home because the tax breaks are crazy. Like the tax advantages of owning your own home are insane. You get a mortgage interest deduction. So basically you get to deduct whatever interest you pay on your mortgage from your taxes. Okay. This is a huge tax break. This is very regressive. This is essentially a massive penalty for renters and a huge bonus for homeowners. Homeowners are typically richer than renters. So this is essentially the most regressive tax in the US. So terribly regressive, essentially distributes money from renters to homeowners. Not to mention you do anything to your house, you get to write that off. So it's like there's all sorts of tax advantages built into home ownership. And the US is kind of like this whatever vaunted view of home ownership. So there's not much push to try to change this. Good luck. If you're a politician, you want to change this, good luck. No homeowner is going to vote for you. Try getting elected without the homeowners. We also have all this single family zoning where, neighborhoods, 75% of LA is zoned for just single family housing. Single meaning like you can't have triplexes, you can't have duplexes, you can't have apartments on this land. It has to be single family house. Again, that's partially from again, from this yeoman idea of Jefferson, but it's also from, not wanting neighborhoods to change. Neighborhoods typically don't change in character if there's single family housing. The neighborhoods can change much more rapidly when there's like more denser housing. So that's part of the impetus of this. And then this NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard. There's single family homeowners are very, very opposed to change. So we build all this on top of each other. We build this sort of idealized version of home ownership on top of each other. And what happens is it makes it very, very hard to build apartment complexes in cities. Essentially, it's illegal. In most of LA, it's just illegal to build apartments, or it's very, very expensive to get it through all the different hoops you need to get it through. Not to mention, all of your wealthy people want to own homes. All your wealthy people want to own homes because of the tax breaks. Essentially, you're stupid if you don't own your own home once you reach a certain income point because of the tax breaks. So what does this lead to? It leads to now everybody wants to live in a city. That's where the economic activity is. We can't build housing in the cities. It's very hard to build housing because of all this stuff. So the home prices, the rental prices skyrocket because there's not enough housing in the cities for the people because of all these issues. So great job, Jefferson. Yeoman idea, wonderful. But when we get to 2020, 2021, now everything's way too expensive in our cities because you made it so we can't build. Great. Wonderful. So yeah, we have suburban sprawl, which is bad for the environment, and inflated home prices. That's the legacies. All right. Okay. Now so that sort of gives you the history of land ownership and the push westward, how these things were organized, the legacies that are still with us. Now we're just going to kind of have a little bit of fun and look at some weird land episodes in U.S. history.